Whether by individual escapes from slavery, by voluntary manumissions in the antebellum South, or by general emancipation by law in the northern states, a black class of free persons of color emerged long before the Emancipation Proclamation. The more prosperous of these families were able to educate their own children, sometimes through college, and these were typically lighter-skinned people, as well as people with generations of a head start in freedom and acculturation, as compared to the mass of enslaved blacks.
We're talking about the cultural differences that developed between the free people of color who had escaped or were set free at a relatively early time in slavery, and the blacks who had basically had to endure slavery until the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And so the free people of color, they moved northward and they adopted many of the customs of the northerners, right? But the blacks, what they did is they kept much of the culture that they picked up from the slave environment, right? And so as a consequence, these groups, they became essentially completely different and separate people, right? But later on, they were prevented from remaining separate, as we'll see as we continue reading in the book right here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell, to see if we can get some understanding.
The net result was that the elite among American Negroes tended to be, and to remain for generations after emancipation, a racially mixed group that married among themselves and formed a socially exclusive class.
We talked about this in part 7, where a good portion of the free people of color had fathers of European descent, who in many cases were the ones who set them free, right? And so they did what all other humans do that have some sense, and that was they get together with other people who share similar values and goals, right? And they formed a socially exclusive class, which in my opinion was in their best interest, right? And today it's for sure an absolute requirement, right, for those climbing out of the pit.
Among 19th century Negroes in Philadelphia, for example, 85% of mulatto men married mulatto women and 93% of black men married black women. This was not solely a matter of color prejudice, for there were major behavioral differences between the two groups.
They weren't marrying each other only because of skin color, according to Dr. Thomas Sowell. But the mulattoes and the black people, they also thought and behaved completely different from one another, right? And this was the result.
The mulatto neighborhoods had lower crime rates and a higher percentage of their children attending school, as compared to the black neighborhoods, even though it can hardly be claimed that school attendance or crime rates are genetically predetermined.
This was not a genetic thing, but rather a cultural thing, since those blacks were bringing with them a culture that was optimized to survive and cope as a slave, right? And it was unfitting for people in a free society, which attributed to them having neighborhoods with higher crimes and children that attended school less frequently.
In short, there were major cultural differences, and these differences in turn produced other differences, such as a higher occupational status, better housing, and more wealth among the mulattoes. Nor was this pattern confined to Philadelphia. All across the country, north and south, the elite of the Negro community were lighter in complexion than the masses, and very self-conscious and sometimes snobbish about that fact.
Here we go. They had taken the drug. What drug? The drug of feeling superior to others simply because someone has a lighter skin color, right? And so they had become agents for colorism and the racial system that the colonizers set up to keep people with richer skin color as permanent slaves. And so this also shows that people other than Europeans could be agents for these type of ideas. And so anyone that's a human could be an agent for this type of idea. And at this time, we're seeing how the mulattoes were agents.
Among the consequences of the extreme range of education and acculturation within the Negro community has been the larger society's erection of racial barriers provoked by black rednecks, which barriers then deeply offended those individuals at the other end of the cultural spectrum.
When the larger society came across those black rednecks, or simply black people, after they witnessed how those people were acting, they set up barriers to keep all people classified as black people or Negroes at a distance, right? And this hurt some of the feelings of the mulattoes and the other free people of color who wanted acceptance from those other groups. And so E. Fraser Franklin, he talks about this in the book Black Bourgeoisie, where he basically says that the black elite, what they basically did is they wanted to just impress the whites, right? Which is very slave-like, right? If you ask me, even more slave-like than what the blacks were doing, or just as slave-like. You see, it's one thing to borrow aspects of culture from another group to develop yourself and to develop the group. But it's a completely different thing when people are trying to do it to impress the other group, right? That's something completely different. And that's not what we're talking about here on this channel, right? But nonetheless, the other groups, they didn't care, right? And so they slapped up those barriers for all the people considered Negro, right? And this was the result of this.
These barriers based on race prevented cultural elites from separating themselves as much as they would like from lower class blacks, with whom they were forced to live in proximity and to share institutions.
And so they were forced to live amongst those blacks who still carried that slave black culture. Uh-oh, it could get spicy at any moment in here.
Yet protests against racial barriers had to be made in the name of all light or dark, leading to charges of hypocrisy against the elites who spearheaded protests against white social and economic barriers, while maintaining their own social and economic barriers against the black lower class.
The Negro elites were called hypocrites because they were doing the same thing to those blacks that they were complaining about the whites doing to them.
That internal social barriers within the black community became more pronounced at the same time as white barriers against blacks in general suggests that more than coincidence was involved, since both occurred in the wake of the mass arrival of black rednecks from the South.
This mass arrival from the South, it happened in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, where you had blacks migrating in droves to the northern and later on the western cities. And so what did they bring with them? That slave culture, right, that they had never been reprogrammed from. And so when you go into those black neighborhoods all throughout America, what you're witnessing in front of your eyes is the continuation of the slave consciousness and how it has shaped and reformed itself over the past centuries and surviving all the way to this day.
Among the behavioral differences between the black elites and the black masses was that the elites had more stable families, with separation or divorce being rare among them. It took more than money or a light complexion to enter the social circles of the black elite. Behavioral standards were also essential, and individuals who met these standards could be admitted with little money and regardless of complexion, though the history of black rednecks meant that few would rise to elite levels.
The way that people think and behave and the values that they possess are much more important than any amount of money that they make, right? And until people really understand this, it's going to be very difficult for people to climb rung by rung out of the pit of darkness to see what it's like to be in the free world, where life is much, much better and it makes more sense. And so this is the end of part 8 commentary on the book here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. And so my name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.